23 years after sovereignty was returned to China, and Hong Kong is facing the biggest threat yet to its prized autonomy. China now plans to get directly involved in the territory's affairs through a new national security law. So is this an assault on Hong Kong's democracy? This is Inside Story. Hello everyone, I'm Kamahl Santamaria. One country, two systems? Don't be so sure about that, because with China moving to pass a national security law for Hong Kong, that could see the most significant reduction in its autonomy since it was handed over by Britain in 1997. Well, there are definitely changes afoot. China's Premier Li Ke-Chiang announced the bill at the NPC, the National People's Congress, China's biggest annual political gathering. The draft law has 7 articles and will almost certainly be approved by the NPC. Once passed, it would allow Chinese agencies to operate in Hong Kong to, quote, prevent, stop and punish acts endangering national security. The thing is, Hong Kong's government says it'll help Beijing enact the law, which of course has upset the territory's pro-democracy activists. On Friday, they and opposition politicians marched to the Chinese liaison office to protest. They were stopped by police who said they could actually only continue in groups of 8 because of a ban on public gatherings due to coronavirus. Protesters say the national security law puts an end to people's political freedoms in Hong Kong. So let's start with an overview from Adrian Brown, our correspondent in Hong Kong.
Well, this has been a dark day for people who were already concerned about autonomy here in Hong Kong. Now, China's leaders say that this new law is needed to combat things like terrorism, succession, sedition, as well as foreign interference. Now, the latter is a reference to the United States, which Beijing has often accused of being behind and funding some of the protests here in Hong Kong. Now, on Friday, this new law was debated by members of China's National People's Congress. That's the parliament, which meets once a year in Beijing. And it seems this new law could take effect as early as August. There were protests in Hong Kong on Friday, as well as skirmishes inside the Legislative Assembly. Now, currently, social distancing rules mean that people can't gather in the streets in groups of more than 8. Now, those rules are due to continue until June the 4th. The question now, I guess, is when will those rules be lifted and what happens when they are? Will there be a return of those big street protests that we saw last year? There was one line in Premier Li Ke-Chiang's speech to the NPC on Friday which has started a lot of speculation here in Hong Kong. That has led to many people suggesting that China might now set up its own spy agency here in Hong Kong, something that would be separate but parallel to the Hong Kong police force.
OK, so before we introduce the panel for today, I want to just take a closer look at this planned law and why it is considered so controversial by many in Hong Kong. I said it before, one country, two systems. That is the rule that defines Hong Kong's relationship with Beijing until the year 2047. It guarantees rights and freedoms for its people. Back in 2003, an attempt by the Hong Kong government to enact a similar national security law was met by widespread protests and the bill was shelved. Now, Beijing has bypassed the territory's legislature and proposed the National Security Bill directly to the National People's Congress. It aims to prevent subversion, foreign interference, and what it describes as terrorism. Right, as promised, here is today's panel. Starting in Hong Kong itself, we have got James Kun-Sun, who is a senior legislator for Hong Kong's Democratic Party in the Legislative Council. In Beijing, Rong Ying is the Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies, and rounding out the panel in Nottingham in the UK, Andreas Fulda, Senior Fellow with the Asia Research Institute at the University of Nottingham. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. We do appreciate your expertise on a very important topic. I want to start with a quote, a very short quote. It's from Human Rights Watch today, who called this the end of Hong Kong. Now, that's a dramatic headline, but James, if I can start with you, is it maybe the end of Hong Kong as we know it, at least?
Well, at least it is a starting of the end of the Hong Kong's autonomy. Well, in the basic law, it said Hong Kong is to legislate on our own of the national security law. And now Beijing legislate for us. And all along, Beijing do not adhere to the International Human Rights Covenant. In Hong Kong, we have a great fear that the Beijing legislation for us may not respect human rights.
Rong Ying, we'll come to you in Beijing. I think your view will probably differ about whether this is the end of Hong Kong.
Indeed, I would say rather than the end of Hong Kong, it was the beginning of a new Hong Kong. It's the beginning of a new, stable, peaceful, and Hong Kong that is law and order is going to be established. As you know that the reasons and the background of establishing and improving, the purpose of this draft decision for the security, national security letter is meant to restore, to protect, to safeguard the national interests, and to restore the law and order in Hong Kong, which has been undermined, disrupted in the past years. So definitely, it is going to see how we're going to have a new Hong Kong, but a new Hong Kong that is going to be stable, going to have a law and order, and it is going to protect the interests, legitimate interests of all the residents of Hong Kong.
OK, I'm going to come back to you on some of those points because I think we might have some disagreement. Just first of all, Andreas, a quick opening word from you, as I say, this idea of the end of Hong Kong as we know it.
Well, certainly what we're seeing here is an overbearing central government, which has effectively disempowered the Hong Kong SAR government. They have marginalized the Legislative Council, and they have suppressed Hong Kong's democracy movement. So, yeah, if this is, the beginning of a new Hong Kong, and what we've just heard, like the implementation of law and order, then certainly the more accurate way to describe that is that we're seeing that Hong Kong loses its rule of law, and it's being replaced by rule by law. And this means, of course, the rules of the Chinese Communist Party. OK, so Rong Ying, I need to come back to you about some of the points you made there. And James, don't worry, we'll come back to you as well. But Mr. Rong, you talk about law and order and stability. And what about all the protests we've seen for so long now? There is so much discontent in the streets of Hong Kong. You can't genuinely think that people are going to accept this and are going to move into some sort of new era of stability and happiness with the situation. In fact, I would suggest quite the opposite.
Well, remember, I think the question of protecting and safeguarding the national interests and national security in Hong Kong is, according to the basic law, the so-called Article 23, it has to be enacted according to that article. I think it's supposed to be enact the laws in its own to protect national interest. Unfortunately, more than 23 years has been passed, and due to the subversion and obstruction of those forces that do not want to see stability, peace, law and order in Hong Kong. It has never been able to do that. And that is why we have seen the past years these violent demonstrations, these acts of terrorism, and the loss of law and order in Hong Kong. That has been not only affect the interests of Hong Kong, the law and order, but also I think certainly the national security of China, of the central government. I think the central government, by proposing this draft decision, and it would help to plug a loophole for national security. And those residents and I think people around the world want to see stability, want to see law and order, want to see, I think, lasting prosperity in Hong Kong that has been enjoyed in the past years, would welcome certainly this legislation.
OK,
but
let's put it. Let me interrupt you. Sorry, Mr. Rong.
They would oppose that. I have no doubt about that.
OK, let me interrupt you. And let's put it to James To in Hong Kong itself. Rong Ying's argument is that this is about, and he used the words over and again, stability, law and order, and national security. It is a national security bill. Tell us, in your experience, how you think all of that is going to be received.
Well, first, it is totally untrue that we don't have any laws against to protect the law and order. But like any other society in the world, we have all the criminal legislation. You throw a bomb, you'll be punished. You hit people, you'll be punished. So we have all the laws to protect law and order. The problem is that Beijing does not adhere to the International Human Rights Covenant. And what the Beijing wants is to curtail freedom of speech. It's not about law and order. It's about freedom of speech, of assembly, peaceful assembly. Well, take for example, recently there are people who are punished under our law for peaceful assembly, for calling on peaceful assembly. I think it is totally against the International Human Rights Covenant. And now Beijing wants more.
So James Toh says it's about assembly and freedom of speech. Rong Ying says it's about law and order and stability. Andreas, what do you think?
Well, I think we need to bear in mind, the role of propaganda. And so what we've just heard from our participant from Beijing, I think falls in that category. I would like to just bring to everyone's attention that China's Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office has actually very recently used what I consider genocidal language, such as referring to Hong Kong's democracy movement as an, quote, political virus, unquote. And they have called for the elimination, and again, I quote, so-called poisonous and violent protesters. And, this is, some of the context we need to bear in mind. And also the Hong Kong police force, which just has been praised as kind of upholding law and order. In fact, they have themselves used dehumanizing language, referring to peaceful protesters as dogs or even cockroaches. So I do think that this kind of belies all of this kind of verbal acrobatics that we're hearing, that this is somehow about national security. This is all about protecting the authority of the Chinese Communist Party, full stop.
Rong Ying, in Beijing, it's very strong language, isn't it? What Andreas just told us about, that's very emotive, and it goes beyond your argument, certainly, about stability and law and order.
Well, I think the two panelists talked about freedom of speech. I don't think we have any problem at all. But the big problem for me, and I think for the people who have the conscious of the legitimate rights, not only I think in Hong Kong, but also in other parts of the China, is that their freedom should not be exercised at the expenses of others. And it should not be the excuse to attack and to use violence against the innocent people. Like, as we have seen the reports, like them, innocent pedestrians and even police officers who is being exercising their duty to protect the law and order. They're being victimized. They're being attacked. And I don't think that is a freedom. This is not the kind of freedom I think people in Hong Kong would like to have. And for any government, I think it was their duty to access to whatever it takes to make sure peace, law and order that has been restored and stability will be maintained.
Right.
And I don't see any reason I think the central government like China should do that. And of course, as a government, central government, I think national security is a duty, and it has all the right to ensure that its national security would not be undermined.
Gentlemen, I've got a list of questions in front of me, but I'm actually just really interested in just getting reactions from each of you to each other at this moment. James, again, I come back to your position as someone who obviously is in the Democratic Party in Hong Kong and who opposes what is going on. When you hear what Rong Ying is saying there about the way police have even been treated, I mean, how does it balance out for you?
Well, I must emphasize again that we have all the normal criminal law against violent behavior. And so anybody who committing such an offense of violence will be punished. And now we are not talking about such normal, ordinary criminal law. What Beijing wants is something more about curtailing freedom of peaceful assembly, who may be calling on something which Beijing think is against their principle, is attacking their reputation. And so we are not talking about violent behavior not being punished by Hong Kong law or not.
Okay, so what we have talked a lot about so far, gentlemen, is the cause and effect, what people feel, what they feel will happen. Andreas, if I can come back to you just for, well, okay, let me play devil's advocate here a little bit. Yes, there is one country, two systems, but in the end, sovereignty over Hong Kong rests with China, and the government in Hong Kong are appointees of China. Therefore, I'm not going to say China can do what it wants, but it does have the final say over all of this.
But, you know, the Chinese Communist Party also signed the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is an internationally binding treaty, which is lodged with the United Nations. And, of course, the United Kingdom is one of the signatories. And based on that internationally binding treaty, they made a pledge that they would not change the system over 50 years. They're doing it now after 23 years. So that shows us that they're not honoring international law. So this is a direct attack actually on the international rule-based order. So let's not, you know, let's be very clear about this. And, you know, we have to discuss Hong Kong also in relationship to Taiwan. Premier Li Ke-Chiang today spoke about Taiwan. He omitted the term peaceful when talking about the desire from the central government to, quote unquote, reunify with Taiwan. And so what's happening in Hong Kong will not, you know, it will not stop there. I think Taiwan is very much in sight for the central government. And that is incredibly concerning, given that this is a self-governing, liberal democracy, an open and vibrant society.
Well, Andreas, seeing as you brought up this issue, and it's definitely on my list of questions to do with the international obligations, this international pact which was signed, that broadens it out to how others will react. Now, the United States has said it will react strongly. It's saying Beijing should reconsider its disastrous proposal. The UK expects China to respect Hong Kong's right to freedom. Again, they're all strong words, but what can/will the international community actually do if this law comes into force?
Well, based on the principle of reciprocity, there's a lot that the US government and the British government can do. See, if they violate this internationally binding treaty, then the US government, the UK government, they can also take very unfriendly acts. For example, they can, and I think they will, sanction individuals both in mainland China but also in Hong Kong who are complicit with this law. And so we've seen such actions being taken against Russian oligarchs, and I think we're now nearing a stage where we will see similar actions taken against officials both in mainland China and in Hong Kong.
Rong Ying, does that sort of stuff concern you, the way the international community might react? If we're judging by what's been said already, that was actually Mike Pompeo who said that it was a disastrous proposal and that Beijing needed to abide by its international obligations.
Oh, let me, before I respond to these points, let me just briefly respond to the points made by the reason why we should have that legislation or draft decision, since already in Hong Kong we have criminal laws and the legal system. That is exactly the reason why we would like to have that, because the the criminal system or criminal law so far has not been effective enough to do with that. And more importantly, I think the issues we're talking about, they are much complicated, and then, as we have seen, they are much more sort of related or relevant to the national security issues. That's why I think the central government would like to do that. It is purely for the sake, as I said repeatedly, for the good of Hong Kong. As for the possible and the responses or sanctions by the hostile forces, or include, I mean, as the British panelist mentioned, I think China firmly believe that it's doing the right thing, and China, as a sovereign state, it has the right to do its whatever it means to safeguard its national security, exactly like the US and the UK would do. And China will not be afraid of any kind of sort of intervention for that. Rather, with the adoption of that national security law, I think China will be more effectively dealing with these things. So threats, sanctions are not going to work for China, and I don't think China will be sort of afraid of that.
Okay, James To, do you expect? Well, you already hear the words of support coming from the international community. Again, in that statement from Mike Pompeo, he said, "We stand with the people of Hong Kong." Do you think they will actually take action that will have an effect on the ground?
Well, I do not want to speculate because, after all, Hong Kong is an international city. And when the Chinese government lobbied for support of the international community to support the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the implementation of the one country, two system, we actually, the Chinese government actually lobbied for support and registered the agreement in the United Nations. So there are many stakeholders, international investors, concerning Hong Kong. So it is very natural that every stakeholder, every state will like to protect their interests about their national, their way of living in Hong Kong, as promised by the Chinese government. I think I want to end by saying that, reminding the international community that the Beijing recent proposal would put mainland national security people in Hong Kong street to enforce the law. And they have not a very good track record of respecting human rights. So that is a point of worry.
James To, just a quick final thought from you, actually, before I go to Andreas, is you use that phrase, Hong Kong as an international city. Do you believe that's under threat? When we think about Hong Kong, all the expats who live there, the international companies, the international markets, is that genuinely under threat in your view?
Well, I genuinely feel that the international visitors, the companies, executive, they may inadvertently committed these very draconian and serious law proposed by Beijing recently.
Andreas, what's, in your opinion, the worst-case scenario for Hong Kong? Would people want to leave? Would investments fall? Would it, and this was another description I heard of it earlier today, it would become, quote-unquote, another Chinese city?
You see, the proposed national security law is really a game changer for Hong Kong, for mainland China, but also for the world. Hong Kong really has now become, has come to the forefront of what is actually a systemic rivalry between an increasingly totalitarian China and Western liberal democracies. And as such, the international community does need to not just pay attention to what's happening in Hong Kong, but actually has to push back, because it will not end there. I mentioned Taiwan before. And so if we don't want to see a war in the Taiwan Straits, it must be made very clear to the authorities in Beijing that this has to stop.
Andreas Fulda from the University of Nottingham, I do appreciate that final thought there. Also, Rong Ying from the China Institute of International Studies in Beijing, and James To Kun-Sun from the Hong Kong Democratic Party. Gentlemen, thank you all. And thank you for joining us today, wherever you're watching us. Thanks for being a part of the show. You can catch it or any of our previous editions online at aljazeera.com. Facebook as well. We're at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, at AJ Inside Story on Twitter, and at Kamahl AJE if you want to message me or tweet me directly. I am Kamahl Santamaria from the whole Inside Story team. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.